One of the biggest mistakes I see buyers make is overpaying for a condo without even realizing it. My name is Chris Jordan. I'm a luxury real estate agent here in New York City, and I help buyers navigate the luxury condo market in Manhattan and Brooklyn. In this video, I'm breaking down 5 ways I see buyers make mistakes and how to avoid it. Number 1, emotional buying in a competitive market. I do want to acknowledge that buying real estate, especially if it's your primary residence, is an emotional decision, and I totally understand that. With that being said, when I do talk to buyers, they always tell me that they don't want to make an emotional decision, and they want something that they'll be happy with in 5 to 10 years. So that's always my job, to make sure I keep us on track, right? So I've created this framework to help me and my clients get to that end goal, and I want to share it with you. So when I talk about emotional buying in a competitive market, this is what I mean, right? One way that's created in New York City is through open houses. Smart sellers and their agents like to create this competitive environment through open houses by scheduling open houses in a small time window. So it might be 1 to 2 hours, and they do this in the beginning of the process when the apartment first go live. So they gather all the interested prospective buyers and they have them come in this small window. And what happens is a lot of buyers get there and there may be a long line. They may be waiting a little bit while the seller agent is showing the other buyers the apartment. They may get this list where they write their name, their email, my name, some of my information. They may see 40 people stopped at this open house. And one thing I see, and I've seen this so many times, is that once buyers see this, almost the competitive nature kick in. And what happens is they get attached and they ask, how can they win the apartment instead of asking what it's worth, right? And I know this is easier said than done, but before the process, before we see any apartment, I always ask my clients to practice the art of detachment and not to fall in love with an apartment, and that's much easier said than done. Let's talk about how to avoid it. I think the first way to avoid it is whoever your representation is. I always my job, ideally, is to find you multiple apartments that you love or you like, right? Because that will not only make the process smoother, but it will also make the negotiations easier. You know the age-old saying, you can't negotiate if you're not willing to walk away. And that goes into the next point and the next way to avoid it. I always say before you go into any search, you should have a nice range. And I think we spoke about this in a negotiation video, but a lot of our videos just kind of coincide together. But I think a smart way to go into negotiations is definitely have a walkaway number, because when you get in these environments where you almost feel that competitive nature, that emotional side of your brain kick in, you can always go back to that number that you spoke about before the search. So I think those are 2 ways to avoid it. 1, finding multiple apartments that you love, and 2, having a walkaway number. Number 2, confusing asking price with market value. A lot of buyers assume asking price is where the property is worth, and that is just not how asking price works in New York City, right? As an agent and somebody who's familiar with the market, the only thing asking price really do for me is it brings me into the mind of the seller. So what do I mean by that, right? There's 2 different types of sellers. When I see an asking price that's close or a little bit below market value, the first thing I think of is that seller's serious and they really want to sell in a timely manner. And then you have sellers who price it a little high, a little ambitiously. Let's call it a little ambitiously. And some of those sellers are efficient, but it also depends the market, right? I think right now you can see some units priced ambitiously because in New York City, we're low in inventory. We don't have a great deal of inventory right now on the market. So they can still get their number in some cases. Now, a lot of times you see this, and I always look at properties and I always star it that's priced ambitiously because I want to know if they sell. A lot of times I do go back to a lot of these units and look at the acres and see who bought it, right? And a lot of times New York City is a global market, and you sometimes get people outside of the market, outside of the country, that just want to live in a certain neighborhood. And listen, the price is the price. The market is what people are willing to pay. So you can't always look at people who price it high as people that's fishing. I kind of took that word out of my dictionary. I don't say fishing anymore. I just say they price it ambitiously because sometimes they do get their number. I have to be honest with that. But for me, I look at it, if they over 10% of the market value, personally, I disregard it, but sometimes they get those numbers. So Just to recap, there's two types of buyers. There's buyers that price it at market value or a little bit below. Those are buyers that are serious about selling. They want to sell in a timely fashion. And then there's buyers that price ambitiously, and those buyers are just looking for a certain number, and they're only willing to sell at that certain number. How to avoid it, right? How to avoid overpaying. I don't want to say how to avoid the ambitious sellers, but how do you know who's ambitious and who's not? The number one thing is looking for comparable sales. And when it comes to comparable sales, golden rule, if you can, you want to stay in the building. You want to look for something in the building that's comparable. We like to call it lines, right? So usually the lines all have similar layouts. Line 9 might be all the south-facing units. So let's say you're interested in 8-9, unit 8-9. You might want to look at if they have 11-9, see what that sold for. If 10-9 sold, that would tell you the difference between 11 and 10. Now, sometimes you are going to have to put some pieces to the puzzle, but if you can stay in the building, that's ideal. Now, if it's a boutique building or not enough units sold in the building and you want to just look outside the building, price per square footage will be number 2. So 1, you want to look inside the building. 2, you want to look at price per square footage. But price per square footage can get very murky, and you really have to look at even more intricates, right? Because you can look in one neighborhood, you have to separate co-ops versus condos, and then even buildings sell a little bit different because a lot of buildings have different amenities, different finishes, different infrastructure. There's just so many different variances in between buildings that sometimes price per square footage do not tell the entire story. You can be in one neighborhood and you can see a building going for $1,900 per square foot, and in the same neighborhood you can see something going for $3,000 per square foot, and that's a huge difference, huge difference. So there's a lot of things that goes into pricing, right? But I always tell buyers, you just have to know the neighborhood, know the building, and know the little intricacies that goes into pricing. Number 3 is ignoring the building. I think when it comes to ignoring a building, this is the biggest mistake because this is the hardest one to catch in all honesty. So I'm speaking of financial reserves, any upcoming assessments, deeper than how the kitchen looks. I think this is the most important because a lot of times this is hard to find. Even for me, if I'm not familiar with the building, what I like to do is lean on the lawyers because attorneys are privy to this information, and attorneys on average do more deals than agents. So if I haven't done a deal in a building, or if I'm not familiar with the building, I always can call an attorney and just get some updates on the financials of the building. And I have one rule. If it's hard to find the financials of a building, there is a reason for that. But you definitely want to know all the financials because, again, one, you don't want to get stuck in a building with poor financials. And I think we spoke about this in post-closing liquidity, but again, all our videos kind of go together. You don't want to get stuck in a building with bad financials because not only is it going to be stressful on you, but it might be stress to sell as well, right? So let's talk about how to avoid it. I think gold standard is looking at how the building performed historically, right? It's a new development. Look at the developer's history. 4, understanding the total cost. A lot of buyers only focus on the purchase price, but the total cost is everything combined. So we're talking closing costs, holding costs, taxes, because all those things can add up. So let me tell you how I like to advise buyers on how to avoid it. Purchase price is important, but I also like to create a term sheet for my clients where they see to analyze the total monthly cost. So that's closing costs with all the different taxes. And then that's holding costs. And I think if you have 2 or 3 units that you're comparing, you should also compare the holding costs, not only in 1 year, but in 3 years and 5 years. Even if the purchase price is similar, because that's going to tell a total different story. You can have 2 units that have similar purchase price that have totally different holding costs, different taxes, different monthly charges. I think that's honestly a great way for you to separate units and for units to separate themselves in accordance to your plans. Number 5, overextending for the dream unit. I've seen plenty of times buyers stretch their budget for buildings, amenities, views, and that's okay. Again, that creates short-term happiness, certainly, but it also can create long-term pressure. And let's talk about how to avoid it. Look, if you found a way to buy an apartment in New York City, you've already done something great. So I don't want to be a motivational speaker, and I'm certainly not your accountant, and I'm certainly not your wealth management, and you don't really need much advice. But what I am here to do is give you great real estate advice, right? That's my job, to give you great real estate advice. And I always tell buyers, life is about evolution, and don't be afraid to evolve. The likelihood that this will be your last purchase in Manhattan real estate is, in all honesty, slim, right? So it's okay to look 5 and 10 years down the line and get that better kitchen, get that better view, get that higher floor, get that building with the better amenities. I never would suggest having fear of missing out in New York City real estate, because let me let you in on a secret. Even when units aren't on the market, they're on the market. So again, going back to section 1, always have that walkaway number, and don't never be blown away or overextend for a unit outside your budget. With that being said, one thing I see a lot is that a lot of buyers don't just overpay because of price, they overpay because they don't have frameworks. So I hope these 5 frameworks give you a great idea so you can make a decision that you're not only happy with next month, but you're happy with 10 years, 10 years from now, right? My name is Chris Jordan. I'm a luxury real estate agent right here in New York City. If you're planning on moving to New York City in the next 6 to 12 months, you have any questions about the process, you can always shoot me an email here. Other than that, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. If you like this video, please watch the next video on the screen, and I'll see you on the next one.